Hi guys, and welcome to the second of my two videos about the Carlisle Simsig simulation. In the first video I covered the easier era, which is the 2000s, and running the 2003 I think it is timetable. And the simple fact is, in the 2000s through Carlisle on the west coast, you pretty much have fixed formation passenger trains, so you have Voyagers, you have Pendolinos. There are very few locomotives on passenger trains and a limited amount of freight, but not really very much. And the first thing to say really is, before you consider playing the harder era, which is the 1985 era, you should definitely play the easier 2000s a couple of times, and that will just help you to learn how to do some of the harder maneuvers. So things that happen in both, like getting trains into and out of Dalston oil siding, and just learning how to do that nice and quickly, learning where the different places are, Low House Crossing, Corby Gates level crossing, etc., because doing that will make then moving to the 80s much more straightforward. Now, you can do the 1980s era with just one person. It'll be a bit tricky. When you first play it, you might have to slow it down slightly below normal speed just to get on top of everything. But let's just go through the whole thing page by page, starting at the south end, and just explain how this all works. So the south end looks very similar to the 2000s era. Most of it's the same. Some of the line speeds are a bit slower, and that actually makes regulating trains slightly easier in the 80s era, because the passenger trains tend to go a maximum of 100 miles an hour. Some of them only go 80, so that because they're not going much faster than some of the class 4 freight trains, there is a lot less in the 80s of having to take freights into the goods loops in order for the class 1 trains to go past. So other than that, this is all the same. The automatic working is the same in this era as it is in the 2000s. So that's the Windermere line from Oxenholme. You then have all the same loops. I think these are all the same size, all work in the same way. Shap Summit again, Hardendale Quarry and Harrison Sidings. You generally have more freights. This is a general thing across the 1980s era. Generally more freights anyway. You have services to Shap Quarry, which I don't think you have in the 2000s timetable at all. You have more trains to Hardendale Quarry in the 80s. You can see this one's already signalled into there. More of those are also going between Harrison and Hardingdale and vice versa. So there are a few more services there. There are also services into and out of the engineers' sidings at Penrith and T-Bay there. But otherwise, the lower end of the simulation from Carnforth North Junction up to Upper B is basically the same as the 80s, so that's nice. If we go to the south of the main station, so the track layout is largely the same, but again, there are a lot more freights, including trip freights. So a trip freight generally has a T code, so 9T34 would be a trip freight, and trip just means they're local services between places like Petrel Bridge Sidings, Curragh wagon Sidings in Curragh Yard, the Metal Box Company, those sorts of things. Quite a few of those, so there's a lot more kind of going on here generally. Upper B Yard is in use in the 80s very heavily, so you got lots of empty coach in stock movements come out of the yard here. They often run around, the loco will run around, so you have here a ground frame. Like most of the ground frames in Carlisle, if we find Upper B run rounds, you tend to just have a single lever, and it works, as it does in most cases, by left clicking the free button to free the frame. Once the frame's free, you can hit the release button, and then the shunter or driver will do whatever they need to do on the ground. So what happens in general is a train will come out here with the loco on the south end. The loco will automatically detach and run to this signal over here. You will see a separate track circuit indication, so you can see that the locomotive's been separated. As soon as it gets to here, you can free the ground frame, release the lever for Upper B run round. The locomotive will automatically reverse, go into the run round loop, and then you'll need to signal it like this is back into the yard. and then a few minutes later that same locomotive usually, or a different locomotive, will reappear from Upperby Yard to then couple onto the north end of the train to take the train in. The thing that's then annoying is if it's a southbound service, you then have to do the same run round in the station, but hey, that's what it's like in real life, so that's fine. Up here there's not a lot different than usual. You've got lots of these DMUs going to and from, usually platform 2 at Carlisle, same as the 2000s. One of the things you'll notice a lot on this timetable particularly is you'll often find trains with the same head code on at the same time. So we've just sent 2P59 to Wigton, but a different 2P59 is coming into Carlisle. The reason that's important is when you click on a head code, you're obviously used to seeing, sorry, I'm just trying to drag that across, you're used to seeing this kind of thing, and in this case it's selected the correct service. But what you've got to be careful of is if there are 2 or sometimes 3 of the same code in the area at the same time, then clicking a particular code may or may not bring up the correct service. So just to kind of make sure of what you're doing, if you press F2 instead, first of all you can see the specific code. So in the case of 1M20 there's obviously only one of those, which is why its unique ID is the same as its head code. But in the case of any that have a repetition, you'll see here you've got 2M72C, so there would have been a 2M72A and B. There might be more than that as well. For some of the other freights, there are more letters, and again, that's just whatever the timetable writer has decided to use in this instance. But there is a particular time when there are 3 5T01s in the area at the same time. So you just got to be real careful. Otherwise, what you can do is you can click on something, get the wrong timetable come up, and then you don't know what's going on. So from the train list here, you can right click. If let's say you had two of these 2P59s, you identify that this is the one moving down, this is the one that's Whiteham to Carlisle, so that's the one I'm interested in. So what I can do is I can right click this here, timetable, edit timetable, and then I can see exactly what service that is and where it's going. So sometimes you don't always have to do that. You can sometimes work out fairly easily. If you've got, say, a train like this and you click on it, you can see that this is clearly the correct service because it's 12:01. That's service leaving at 12:06 towards Lockerbie. The other major difference here that you might have noticed already is the original through goods lines are present in the 80s. So in 1984, I believe it was, a train coming down here, coming down the incline from Shap, basically separated. So the signalman, who was thinking very quickly, managed to get the front part of the train to come through towards the station, and under control the driver was able to stop that part. And then the signalman signalled the back of the train, which was running away, down through here, through Bog Junction to Rome Street, and just at Rome Street it basically came off the tracks here, busted up the bridge. And so rather than fixing it, they decided it wasn't worth replacing the goods lines by that point because the freight was fairly minimal. So this in the 2000s era is closed. I think it's actually broken here, so you don't see this junction in the 2000s anymore. Forks Junction's gone. This junction's here, but you'll see that the tracks just kind of go to nowhere, and so you can't signal anything through there. So what that means is, as opposed to the 2000s when most of the freight trains will go through the station, in this era, any train that isn't scheduled for a crew change or a stop in the station will tend to go through the avoiding lines, and that includes some empty coaching stop for passenger trains, but mostly it is freight services. And nothing much particularly to worry about, except that all of these lines are crisscrossing each other and the line speed here is very low. So don't do, if you've got a service here, don't kind of necessarily signal it all the way through to, say, Wigton, because then if another service like 9L84 is trying to come around here, which is what's happening at the moment, it hits a stop and it could be waiting there longer than expected, because some of these line speeds are only 10 miles an hour or 5 miles an hour. So the trains can move very slowly, but other times they seem to get around it quicker than you expect. So it's definitely part of the simulation you need to keep an eye on. Most of the rest of this, again, is pretty similar. The only difference is some of these sidings will be in use. You might have one or more services a day. For instance, there's a trip freight goes to Petrol Bridge. Sometimes it goes from the bridge to the sidings, which gives you a phone call. You signal it through, it comes out again, it comes up to the reverse signal, it goes into SO, comes back out. So all of that fiddling around. None of it's particularly difficult by itself, but with the volume of trains that you're dealing with, then it can kind of be a bit of a problem. Same general issue in the station. So the signalling here was slightly more simple in the 80s. SB and SC are basically sidings. They're not designed as through roads. So you see that they're signalled as exit points here. Whereas in the 2000s, these are signalled all the way through, a bit like they are up here in this era. A lot of shunting work takes place in the station, an awful lot. Certainly in the early hours of the morning. You see at the minute I don't actually have anything scratch pads useful. I don't have any services currently waiting in any of these sidings or any of the bays particularly. But in the mornings at some points you might have 2 or 3 separate services all in SB dividing and joining. You've got shunting locos moving backwards and forwards and all over the place. And basically don't expect to get 100% timing, because it's just not going to happen. There's way too much going on. And on top of that, this timetable was taken from a time when the East Coast had a collapsed tunnel, and because of the collapsed tunnel, there were services from Edinburgh that were diverted via Carlisle to go back down towards Newcastle on the East Coast. So you'll tend to have 1E services in this timetable, generally use platform 3 and go down to Corby Gates. The northbound trains tend to be 1S codes, a bit like they are from Euston as well. So what S for Scotland, I guess. So you've got all of those extra services to deal with. You also get the same crew changes, and some freight crew changes occur in the station area, either in a siding or in one of the platforms. And as with all crew changes, it means you've got to keep an eye on that and make sure that you don't bring services into the station too early, because generally the crew change. I'm not sure if either of these are having a crew change. No, the crew changes don't tend to happen early. So bringing a service in 20 minutes early is just going to block a platform for 20 minutes. So as with the 2000s, you need to keep an eye on that. The other thing with the station is Wapping sidings is in use. So Wapping sidings is basically a diesel locomotive stabling point. So all of the loco changes that take place tend to take a loco will appear at Wapping sidings. You might have to reverse here. You might have to go out the other end of the station and couple onto a train. The electric locos that come off tend to wait in the sidings here for an hour or two, and then they will go back out and connect on the bottom of a southbound service. Not everything changes loco, but there are a reasonable number of loco changes. Collier Lane tends to be used for things like motor rail vehicles and parcels vehicles and stuff like that. So again, stuff happening in the morning, not very much happening during the day. So that is present in the 2000s. It just doesn't get used very much. All of these sidings get used in this era as well. So again, just general volume of traffic, nothing particularly tricky. As we go north of the station, one of the things to note here compared to the easier 2000 version is that these lines here are only unidirectional. So in the 2000s, these were both made bidirectional, which made some of the movements in the top of the station slightly easier, especially with the avoiding lines closed. It made it easier to bring freight trains through, could go up either channel while trains coming in, could use either road as well. So notice here you can't do that. All of the southbound trains have to come to signal 336, and all the northbound trains have to come out of 431. So other than that, this is largely the same, this section of it, as the 2000s. There's a lot more happening at Kingmore Depot. So you've got services, particularly locos, but not just locos, coming in and out of the depot in both directions. Some of the locos using the shunting neck and going back in, some of them coming into the station. There is a small amount of traffic between Denton Holme and the electricity works and elsewhere. So again, just be careful not to set too many signals in advance for a train. One of the tricky bits I found is this whole section here. So in the 80s, there was a lot more going on in the Kingmore yards, and most of the services coming north will go via the downgoods or the recessing sidings. Even if they're going to go northbound afterwards, they often stop in here. And theoretically, as a service like 9034 approaches, usually by the time you've signalled it to here, then the yard will automatically allocate a slot. A message will come up in here saying that the train's been accepted, and then once that light comes on here, the round all gets lit up. You can signal the train through as normal. The problem that I'm facing at the moment is I had a service that came from the upsidings here, had to go this way, this way, this way, after 9034 had already been accepted. So I sent 9L85 into the slot that the yard had accepted 9034 on, and now I can't seem to get this to get accepted. I'm going to wait a while, and hopefully eventually the yard will wake up and let my service in. You can call Kingmore Yard, but what tends to happen, if you call Kingmore and say I've got this service, it will tell you that you can send it to, say, the down recessing sidings, but it doesn't give you the slot. So it doesn't tend to really work. Not quite sure why else you would ever call the Kingmore shunter. The other thing that happens a lot is you've got a lot of services that will go into the fuel and inspection inwards. Most of those come from the upgoods, so they might have been an arrival here like 0M00 has just arrived in the up arrival. It's come up the upgoods into here. And likewise, lots of services coming out of the fuel inspection line and then will be sent into either UD1 or UD2. But at the same time, you get a reasonable number of services coming out of the departure lines from the yard here. So you can send a service from here to UD2 at the same time that a service is coming out of UD1. So you can run those in parallel. You just got to be a little bit careful that you don't gridlock the place, because at some points there's a crazy number of services using this. You also get a number of services, not many, that will come in on the downline here, but rather than going into one of these, they will be timetabled to go into one of the departure lines. And that might be because it's a come from Denton Holme and it's going into here, so it can depart back southbound, but whatever, it sometimes goes into there. The good news is for this era, once we get to the top, is this is actually much easier in the 80s than it is in the 2000s. And the main reason is that Floreston in the 80s was an automatic half barrier crossing. So you don't have to operate this in the 80s as you do have to in the 2000s era. What that means is you can leave signals autoed all the way like this and it just works, which is great. Likewise, you don't have to acknowledge trains arriving on the downgoods like you do have to in the 2000s. All you have to do is when a train's coming and you're happy to send it, you just signal it out onto the main line and everything just works. And likewise, in the 2000s, you have to you have to wait for the hot axle box detector to be cleared before you can set the route into the yard. In this case, that all just happens automatically. So again, nothing much to do there at all. The other thing to notice is there is no Gretna Green station. In the 80s, it wasn't built yet, or I think it was built originally, and then it got taken out, and then it got built again. And this is a single line here, all the way from pretty much from Gretna Junction all the way through to Annan. And notice here that as opposed to the 2000s, this section of line is under Carlisle's control. In the 2000s, our control ends here, and the two-track line, as it was restored for more services, is actually under the control of, I think, Dumfries signal box in the modern era. The part here is identical to 2000s. We have the repeater up here, which gives us a bit more notice of approaching trains. And the Quinton Sill loops, all the rest of it, that's all still the same. Again, differences, line speeds are lower. Trains don't tend to need as much regulating, so there's a lot of class 4 freights tend to go roughly the same speed as the class 1 freights for the most part, so there isn't as much putting things into loops and stuff. But otherwise, most of that part is kind of the same, so you've got a little bit less work to do up the top end. a lot more work around the yards area, a lot more work around the station, certainly at particular times. And other than that, if you are pretty good at running the 2000s era, you won't struggle too much with this. The only thing that might take you some time when you first start is understanding the kind of timetabling of some of these services. So some of them in the morning, I'm not sure if I'll be able to find any of these. If we find, let's say, some of these class 3 services in the morning, ones that have already been, so you get, the usual kind of join and divide rear and all the rest of it, but some of them are very involved. And this might be one here. Let's have a look. Yeah, so you see here this service 3M07. It arrives from Dumfries. Once it gets into platform 4, you see it detaches a loco. We'll assume that's the front end. It then joins 5M07, which will be an existing service that will be in the station somewhere, in a siding somewhere. That will join on the back. We know that because then it will detach rear 0T01, which is one of the pilot locos. And once that's detached, it's going to join a different loco. So probably that was a diesel, which is why it's got the D on the end of it. It's going to join an electric one. And notice they have the same head code, even though they're different locomotives. And then once all of that's happened, this then becomes the next 3M07 service. So it goes from being, 3M07, whatever this one is, 3M07 DMX becomes 3M07 EMX. So the difficulty is when you actually just see it on the timetable, when you click on the service, you can't necessarily quite work out what's happening here. There isn't enough information. So with some of these, you have to go into the timetable edit just so that you can actually look at these things in order and say, okay, detach loco, join another few vans from somewhere, detach the pilot loco at the back, join another one at the front. The timing of some of those can be important. So, for instance, one of the services comes in, both of the locos, so one of them sitting up here, the southbound loco sitting up here ready to go. The other one goes back into Kingmore depot. But of course, if you bring this one down to the reverse signal early, then the loco on the front of the service can't get out. And then you've got to start playing around reversing trains, abandoning timetables, all kinds of messy stuff. So you just got to be a little bit careful. Some of the locos will wait until their departure time before they try and do anything. But of course, that doesn't help if the train's running 10 minutes late and this one kind of goes, oh, I want to go. So you've just got to be a little bit careful. If you're going to join a loco, you're not piloting it. Usually you're swapping it. Just keep an eye on that. Make sure you take the loco off first, get that out the way, then bring the other one. And like I say, don't go for perfection because you'll drive yourself nuts, especially when the phone starts ringing and crews are telling you that they're going to arrive on time, all the rest of it. So definitely lots of fun to be had. I'm sure once you've played this a few times and got the hang of it, you then might want to start looking at editing your own timetables. But certainly another very fun, very useful simulation for this era. Big hats off to the people who designed it. And in case you're wondering, if you actually start Carlisle and you open up the 1980s timetable, if you spend some time reading the notes on the timetable, they go into a lot of detail about some basically the things I've been talking about and probably some other things as well that's worth reading, just so that you kind of got in your head the sorts of challenges that you're going to face. And then just enjoy it, play it a few times, and I'm sure you have lots of fun with it. So thanks for watching. Comments and questions as always underneath, and I'll see you in the next video.